3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability uniquely.
Without a heritage, every generation starts over.
To remind the current regime
what your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
The bottom line is because it's not working.
This is the voice of Linda McMahon, recently confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the Secretary of Education. In this clip, the organization she's referring to as, quote, not working, is the Department of Education. It might be confusing to hear a cabinet secretary doubt the efficacy of the department they oversee, but Secretary McMahon has her reasons. Take a listen.
Department of Education was set up in 1980, and since that time we have spent almost $1 trillion, and we have watched our performance scores continue to go down. I do believe that it is a responsibility to make sure that our children do have equal access to excellent education. I think that that is best handled at the state level, closest to the states, working with state administrators, teachers, parents, who should have input into their curriculum.
Secretary McMahon is now preparing the department for what she refers to as its, quote, final mission, winding down the department itself. This will be a complicated process, but here to explain what it may look like is Lindsey Burke, Director of the Center for Education Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. Lindsey Burke, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Thank you.
So, we're here to talk today about the Department of Education. The second Trump administration, one of their major goals is actually to end the Department of Education, which has created a very vibrant discussion, shall we say. So can you tell us, for starters, what is the Department of Education? How did it come to be? What's it doing?
Yeah. You're very diplomatic to call it a vibrant discussion. I think the special interest groups are beside themselves about the prospect of finally eliminating potentially, or at the very least, hopefully, significantly downsizing this agency, which really has been an utter failure. So we're all incredibly excited to see the progress that's been made so far. And by progress, I really mean almost the rhetorical progress. For a long time, if you walked in a room of DC people and said, you want to abolish the Department of Ed, they kind of snickered under their breath a little bit and would kind of laugh at you. But it's becoming a pretty mainstream conservative position to acknowledge the failure of this agency and that there are some pretty promising paths forward for actually downsizing it.
Okay, so how did it come around in the first place?
Well, it was really, I would say, a marriage of political expediency between the Carter administration and the teachers' unions. So when Jimmy Carter was running for president, he, of course, desperately wanted to become president. And so he made two promises. He said that he would tap Walter Mondale as his VP running mate. And Mondale's brother was a higher up in the teachers' union. Surprise, surprise. And he said that he would create a cabinet-level agency dedicated to education. So prior to 1980, when the department was created, education at the federal level was part of health, education, and welfare. So it was part of other federal agencies, HEW, another federal agency. And so Carter said, I'm going to pull education out, make it its own standalone cabinet-level agency. And he got the vote, the support of the teachers' unions. It was the first time they had endorsed a presidential candidate. And so that when they were newly powerful in the late 70s, so that went a long way in getting Carter ultimately to win the presidency. And so he made good on that promise in 1979 and signed into law the Department of Education Organization Act. And the agency went into operation shortly thereafter in 1980. And as soon as Ronald Reagan comes in 1980, he promises he will abolish Carter's bureaucratic boondoggle. That's what he called it. But even though it's just 6 months later, there wasn't the will in the Senate to get it done. And so it is very much still alive, not well, but alive today.
So what have been the outcomes of that? Have we seen the promises that were offered under the Carter administration come to fruition?
So it's interesting. When Carter made the case for the department, one of the things that he said would happen would be this almost economy of scale type benefit from having a department, or at the very least, that there would be better management of federal education programs because they were somewhat dispersed with some over at most of them over at HEW. But that hasn't happened. That consolidation that would lead to efficiency never happened. Power was consolidated at the department. There are 4,300 people who work at the department. But the outcomes for students, which is what we should care about, have been flat. And unfortunately, in the recent NAEP data, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, have been declining in the wake of the COVID-era teacher union-induced school closures. And so we've got, I would argue, negative academic outcomes, particularly when you contrast it with spending, a negative ROI, because federal spending has more than doubled in real terms, inflation-adjusted federal spending since 1980, since the department was created. And again, academic outcomes are flat and particularly if you look at outcomes, academic attainment outcomes, so graduation rates, college enrollment for low-income students, those have been flat. To me, what is the most concerning data point in all of that is that if you go back a little prior to the Department of Ed being created in 1965, when Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty, there was a gap of about 4 years worth of learning between students from the lowest income decile, the bottom 10%, and the top 10% by income. So it's the 90-10 gap. So the difference between poor kids and more affluent kids was 4 years worth of learning in 1965. Today, it is 4 years worth of learning, that gap. We have not narrowed the gap at all. And that was the whole point of the War on Poverty, right? A third of which, Johnson said, would be fought in the classrooms of America. But the whole point was to narrow that gap. It didn't happen. Creation of the Department of Ed didn't narrow that gap. Ever-increasing federal spending didn't narrow that gap. No Child Left Behind didn't narrow the gap. Nothing the feds have tried to do over the decades has had any impact on improving academic outcomes for students. So what have we gotten? A lot of administrative bloat. We now are in an environment where just 47.5% of all people in school districts are teachers today. So I would argue a lot of that is a reaction to having a federal agency, to having to comply with all of these federal mandates and regulations. You have seen this pretty tremendous increase in bureaucratic bloat. So we've gotten a lot of bureaucratic bloat. We've gotten a centralized agency for special interest groups like the teachers unions to lobby, and unfortunately, bad outcomes for students and taxpayers.
Many families, I'm sure, would say something similar about the way that the Department of Education works. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so certainly. And I'm glad you asked because it's the often overlooked component of the need to wind down the agency. There are certainly ideological bents in the K-12 space, pressures on local schools to go in a certain direction. Think, for example, social emotional learning, right? SEL. Parents will hear this and they know exactly what this represents, right? It is often leftist captured indoctrination at the local school level. But really, where we're seeing so much of the, I would say, subsidy of the left or the woke capture of institutions is with the department and the federal government spending generally in higher ed, right? I mean, higher education, there is no more captured sector in American life than higher education. It is wholly captured by the woke left. How does it operate? Purely, almost, in the public sphere on public subsidies. I mean, student loans and grants are a big part of that, of course. Federal student loans and grants, 93% of all grants are originated and serviced by the federal government, loans and grants. But there are also all of these additional subsidies on overhead costs for research grants, unrelated business income tax loopholes that universities receive, direct research funding. We could go on and on and on. So the Department of Education, as this entity that is managing federal subsidies in higher ed, is certainly putting its thumb on the scale in favor of a certain ideological perspective, surely, when we consider the volume of subsidies that goes to higher education in America. So that's something that winding down the department and ultimately, again, winding down the department and shutting off the lights doesn't mean all of the spending and programs go away. So we have to actually eliminate some of the spending and most of the subsidies in higher ed, the PLUS loan program and being chief among them. But doing so, I think, will lead to a really important course correction in higher education to start to reclaim some of these cultural institutions from the woke left.
So now there's a broad coalition, or there's broad desire within the conservative movement to get rid of the Department of Education completely. Some say, that's great, we can do it. Others say, you can't do it. So what would that actually look like?
Yeah. So you can certainly do it. It's just a matter of how we do it and the processes that are available at our disposal for doing that. So we are awaiting, hopefully, an executive order that would most likely, based on existing reporting, direct the secretary to come up with a plan to wind down the department. So what could that look like for her? A lot of this will require Congress. There are things that could be done through an executive order, executive action. So anything, grants, programs, initiatives, et cetera, that haven't been statutorily authorized, those could be wiped out with an EO. But then Congress really needs to pick up and run with the ball. We've got a couple of bites at the apple. Reconciliation's one of them. That's kind of the next big opportunity. Reconciliation, of course, is attractive because it's a 50 vote rather than 60 vote threshold, but you can only tackle mandatory spending. And at the department, mandatory spending is only on higher ed spending. So K-12 spending is largely discretionary. It's largely competitive grant programs. And so you still down the road need a larger, comprehensive bill to actually wind down the department and tackle all of the additional ineffective, duplicative, inappropriate K-12 programs. And so that's underway right now, model bill, and then ultimately interest in Congress to run with that proposal. So it requires a couple of different levers being pushed to ultimately end and eliminate the department. But there are certainly intermediary steps that would be helpful in downsizing the agency. And I will add to that, there is some people are concerned about what eliminating the department might mean for students, despite the fact that their track record is terrible and it hasn't improved outcomes. What about protections for, say, groups of kids with special needs, for example? I would note that the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was signed into law in 1975. It provides protections for kids with special needs. It predates the creation of the department. That goes nowhere. Spending for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, that would move over to HHS. So that goes nowhere. The same would likely happen with Title I spending for low-income districts. It could be managed by HHS. Data collection, send it over to Commerce. Let the Census Bureau handle it. Student loans, send it to the Small Business Administration or the Treasury Department. So there are more appropriate receiving agencies where you could keep intact some of the appropriate functions of the department, but not actually have the infrastructure that is that massive bureaucratic boondoggle that Carter created.
Imagine down the line, some undeterminate time from now, the Department of Education is successfully wound down. If you are a parent, what would that event look like for you? What would you be thinking about?
Well, first of all, I would be thinking first and foremost that it doesn't have much of an impact on my day-to-day life for my son, because the Department of Education does not educate a single child in America. It does not run a single school. It does not pay a single teacher's salary. And so honestly, things are going to progress as they always have, pretty smoothly. If there are individuals in districts that receive some of those programs I mentioned earlier, Title I, or families who access IDEA funds, hopefully what that would mean is that those families actually have more of a say in how those dollars are spent, that they could, if IDEA could be managed locally, actually tap into those dollars and use them at a school or learning environment that fits their children's unique learning needs. So overall, if the Department of Ed goes away, it means less red tape that binds the hands of state and local leaders. It means fewer man-hours complying with and monitoring and responding to federal mandates from Washington. And in general, it means a growth in education freedom.
Dr. Lindsey Burke, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Lindsey Burke for her contribution to today's episode. If you want to learn more about education choice, student loans, and parental rights, you can find Lindsey's work on all of those subjects at heritage.org or follow her on X at Lindsey M. Burke. Thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.